For 2,000 years, the world has been told one version of the story. But what if the hidden historical evidence they don't want you to know, uncovers a radically different truth? Stay right where you are, because the 7 clues we're about to expose, one by one, will make you question everything. Before we break it all down, take 1 second to hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share it right now. This truth is too important to be kept in the dark, and everyone deserves to know. Let's begin. Part 1. The Mystery of the Empty Tomb. Stolen, moved, or risen. The foundational pillar of the Eastern narrative is the empty tomb. 3 days after a brutal crucifixion, the female followers arrived to anoint Jesus' body, only to find the sealing stone rolled away and the burial cloths neatly folded. For Christians, this is divine proof, the moment death was defeated. But for a critical historian, an empty tomb is not evidence of a resurrection. It is the beginning of a mystery, with numerous plausible, far more terrestrial explanations. Let us, for a moment, set aside the lens of faith and view it as a crime scene. The first, simplest, and often dismissed explanation is body theft. The Gospel of Matthew itself acknowledges this possibility by recording that the Jewish leaders bribed the Roman guards to spread the story that the disciples had stolen the body during the night. Why would this counter-narrative exist within the Scripture itself? Perhaps because it was the most potent and difficult rumor to refute at the time. The disciples, desperate after the death of their leader, had the strongest motive to engineer a resurrection to keep their movement alive. Stealing the body and hiding it would be the logical first step in this grand scheme. They knew exactly where the tomb was, and the guards, if they were even there, may not have been as vigilant as portrayed. Another alternative is the removal of the body by authorities. Pontius Pilate or the religious leaders, fearing the tomb would become a shrine or a pilgrimage site for Jesus' restless followers, may have ordered the body to be quietly moved to an unmarked mass grave. This was a common Roman practice for dealing with the corpses of executed criminals, intended to prevent cults of personality and potential uprisings. To them, Jesus was just one agitator among many. Permanently removing the source of the problem would have been a pragmatic move. In this scenario, the women who came to the tomb genuinely found it empty. Their confusion was real, but their conclusion of a divine resurrection was a leap of faith born of grief and hope, not a fact. An empty tomb does not automatically mean a resurrection. It simply means the body is no longer there. And history offers far less dramatic and non-supernatural explanations for a missing corpse. Part 2. The Gospel Contradictions, a chaotic and unreliable testimony. If a truly extraordinary event like the resurrection from the dead had occurred, one would expect the testimonies of the eyewitnesses to be consistent and harmonious, especially on crucial details. Yet when we examine the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we do not find a harmonious report. Instead, we are confronted with a bewildering web of contradictions and glaring discrepancies that undermine the claim's credibility from a historical evidentiary standpoint. These are not minor variations in storytelling. These are fundamental differences in who, what, when, and where this central event unfolded. Let's start with a simple question. Who first arrived at the empty tomb? According to John, it was Mary Magdalene alone. Matthew says it was Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Mark adds Salome to the group, making it 3 women. Luke, on the other hand, lists Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them. The number and identity of the very first witnesses differ significantly in every account. Then, what did they see at the tomb? Matthew describes an angel of the Lord whose appearance was like lightning, sitting on the rolled-away stone outside the tomb, which caused an earthquake. Mark tells of a young man dressed in a white robe sitting inside the tomb. Luke reports two men in clothes that gleamed like lightning who suddenly stood beside the women inside the tomb. John, in his narrative, initially mentions no angels at all. Only later, when Mary returns, does she see two angels sitting inside the tomb. The contradictions continue. To whom did Jesus first appear? Mark and John agree it was Mary Magdalene. Matthew, however, states the first appearance was to Mary Magdalene and the other Mary together. Luke makes no mention of an appearance to Mary at all, instead recounting the first appearance to two disciples on the road to Emmaus. Even the instructions given by the angelic figure or figures are different. In Matthew, they are told to instruct the disciples to go to Galilee to meet Jesus. In Luke, they are simply reminded of Jesus' prophecies, and there is no command to go to Galilee. These discrepancies are not trivial. In any court of law, such wildly conflicting testimonies would be dismissed as unreliable. Instead of being solid proof, the resurrection narratives in the Gospels looked like a collection of oral traditions that evolved and were altered over decades before finally being written down, each with its own theological agenda rather than as accurate historical records. Part 3. The Psychological Phenomena. The Power of Suggestion and Mass Hallucination. History is filled with examples of individuals or groups under extreme emotional distress experiencing hallucinations or visions that feel profoundly real. The followers of Jesus in the days following his crucifixion were in a psychological state that was fragile and prime for such a phenomenon. Their leader, whom they believed to be the Messiah, had been brutally executed. Their world had shattered, their hopes were dashed, and they were living in fear of persecution. In this state of profound grief, guilt, and intense longing, the human mind has an extraordinary capacity to create its own experiences as a coping mechanism. The hallucination theory offers a potent, psychologically grounded explanation for the post-mortem appearances of Jesus. This is not to say the disciples were liars. On the contrary, they likely genuinely believed they had seen the risen Jesus. Their experiences were most probably sincere, but they originated from within their minds, not from external reality. Mary Magdalene, grieving intensely at the tomb, could easily have mistaken the gardener for Jesus in her sorrow-induced haze, a detail interestingly recorded in the Gospel of John. This powerful experience, when recounted to the other equally distraught disciples, could have triggered a psychological chain reaction. The concept of mass hallucination might sound implausible, but psychologically, what's more likely is a series of individual hallucinatory experiences reinforced within a highly bonded and motivated group. Peter, racked with guilt for denying Jesus 3 times, had a deep psychological need for forgiveness and restoration. A vision of a risen Jesus would fulfill that need. Paul, a zealous persecutor, was haunted by guilt over his actions. His dramatic encounter on the road to Damascus fits the profile of a psychotic break or a temporal lobe seizure triggered by intense internal conflict far better than a divine encounter. Each reported sighting would reinforce the group's belief, creating an environment where others were more susceptible to having similar hallucinations. They weren't all seeing the same thing at the same time, but they were sharing similar experiences that they interpreted through their shared lens of faith and hope. This explains why the appearances were so sporadic, personal, and often ambiguous. For example, the disciples at Emmaus didn't recognize him at first. It wasn't a physical body that rose, but a powerful manifestation of grief, hope, and overwhelming psychological need.
Part 4. The Dying and Rising God Myth. Echoes of Ancient Legends. The narrative of a divine figure who dies and is reborn was not new or unique to first-century Judea. Long before the story of Jesus spread, the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world was rich with similar myths. Deities like Osiris from Egypt, Tammuz from Mesopotamia, Adonis from Greece, and Attis from Phrygia all had mythological cycles involving a tragic death and a triumphant resurrection or rebirth, often tied to the agricultural cycles of the death of winter and the rebirth of spring. The parallels between these pagan stories and the resurrection narrative of Jesus are so striking they cannot be ignored by a critical historian. Was the story of Jesus' resurrection a unique historical event, or was it a Jewish adaptation of a well-established mythological archetype? For instance, Osiris, one of Egypt's most important gods, was brutally murdered by his brother Set, his body dismembered and scattered. His wife, Isis, painstakingly gathered his body parts and, through her magic, brought him back to life. Osiris then became the ruler of the underworld and a symbol of resurrection and life after death. In Mesopotamia, Tammuz, the god of fertility, descended to the underworld, and the grief of his lover, Ishtar, was so great that nature ceased to reproduce. His return marked the return of life. These stories, and many others, were part of the cultural and religious landscape in which early Christianity was born and spread. When the early Christian evangelists and missionaries, like Paul, took their message out of its Jewish context and into the wider Greco-Roman world, they needed to make it comprehensible and appealing to a Gentile audience. Telling the story of a Savior who died and was resurrected would have immediately resonated with people familiar with the myths of Adonis or Attis. It is highly plausible that the core story of a crucified Jewish rabbi was, over time, embellished with these mythological elements to elevate his status from a human martyr to a cosmic divine figure. The Gospel writers, writing decades after the death of Jesus, were not acting as modern historians, but as theologians, using literary and mythological tropes familiar to their audience to convey theological truths about Jesus' significance. The resurrection, therefore, may not be a literal report, but rather a myth that became fact in the minds of his followers, a way of expressing their belief that death did not have the final say over their leader, by borrowing the most powerful narrative framework available at the time. Part 5. The Silence of History. The lack of contemporary evidence. For an event claimed to be the single most important moment in human history, one that supposedly shook the foundations of the cosmos, the resurrection of Jesus is conspicuously absent from contemporary historical records outside of the writings of his own followers. If a man had truly risen from the dead in Jerusalem, a city under intense Roman scrutiny, one would expect to find some record, or at least an echo, in the writings of historians, philosophers, officials, or poets of the time. What we find instead is a deafening silence. The major writers of the first century, Philo of Alexandria, Pliny the Elder, Seneca, Plutarch, mention nothing of Jesus, let alone a miraculous resurrection. They wrote extensively about the history, politics, and strange occurrences of the Roman Empire, yet the event that Christians claim as the victory over death itself completely escaped their notice. The Gospel of Matthew claims that at the moment of the crucifixion, darkness fell over the land, and earthquakes split rocks, and dead holy people rose from their graves and walked around Jerusalem. These are apocalyptic, large-scale events, yet not a single non-Christian source, no Roman, Greek, or even Jewish record from the period corroborates these extraordinary claims. Is it plausible that every historian in the civilized world missed zombies walking the streets of Jerusalem? The earliest and most famous mentions of Jesus by non-Christian historians come from Josephus in his Antiquities of the Jews, c. 93 CE, and Tacitus in his Annals, c. 116 CE. However, both references were written more than half a century after the event and only briefly mention Christ as the founder of the Christian movement who was executed by Pontius Pilate. The passage in Josephus that explicitly mentions the resurrection, the Testimonium Flavianum, is widely considered by scholars to be a later interpolation or insertion by Christian scribes, as its style doesn't match the rest of Josephus's writing, and he remained a devout Jew. Tacitus was merely reporting what Christians believed, not confirming the event itself. This absence of corroborating evidence from impartial contemporary sources is a powerful historical clue. Major events leave a historical footprint. The fact that the resurrection left no footprint whatsoever outside of its own circle of belief suggests it was likely not a public, tangible event, but rather a story that grew and spread exclusively within the community of his followers.
Part 6. The Evolution of Belief, from Spiritual to Physical Resurrection. The belief in Jesus' resurrection does not appear to have emerged suddenly in a complete, finalized form as we read it in the Gospels. Instead, the earliest evidence we have suggests an evolution of the idea, beginning with a more spiritual or visionary concept of resurrection and gradually developing into the doctrine of a literal, physical resuscitation. By tracing this development, we can see how a theological belief can harden into a historical fact over time. The writings of the Apostle Paul are our earliest Christian documents, written only about 20-25 years after the crucifixion, long before the first Gospel of Mark was penned. When Paul speaks of the resurrection in his letters, his language is often ambiguous and leans toward a spiritual or heavenly experience. In 1 Corinthians 15, he lists the appearances of the risen Jesus, including one to himself. However, Paul's own experience on the road to Damascus, as described elsewhere, was of a blinding light and a voice from heaven, not a physical encounter with a flesh and blood body. He places his own experience in the same category as the appearances to the other apostles, suggesting he may have understood them all as spiritual visions, not physical meetings. Furthermore, when Paul describes the resurrection body, he explicitly contrasts it with the worldly body. He speaks of a spiritual body, soma plumatikon, as distinct from the natural body, soma psychikon. This indicates that the earliest Christian understanding of the resurrection may have been closer to an idea of Jesus' exaltation or enthronement into a heavenly realm, from which he then revealed himself to his followers in visions. However, when we turn to the Gospels, written decades later, the narrative becomes increasingly physical and literal. Mark, the earliest gospel, has a famously abrupt original ending, with just an empty tomb and the women fleeing in fear, with no post-resurrection appearances at all. The later verses are widely believed to be a later addition. Matthew, Luke, and especially John, written last, add increasingly physical details. Jesus eats fish to prove he is not a ghost, Luke. He invites Thomas to touch his wounds, John. This escalating emphasis on physicality can be seen as an apologetic response to doubt and outside challenges, an attempt to prove the reality of the resurrection by making it more tangible and concrete. The evolution from Paul's visionary resurrection to the fish-eating physical body in Luke's Gospel is a strong clue that the legend grew and became more exaggerated over time.
Part 7. The motive behind the myth. Why was the resurrection myth created, and why was it so successful? The answer lies in the devastating existential crisis that faced the followers of Jesus after his crucifixion. Crucifixion was not an honorable death. It was the most shameful form of Roman execution, reserved for the lowest slaves and rebels. For a Jewish Messiah who was expected to overthrow the Roman oppressors and establish a new Davidic kingdom, such a death was a total catastrophe. It was proof of failure, a definitive refutation of everything they had believed about Jesus. The movement should have died with its leader on the cross. In the face of this theological wreckage, the early community of followers had only two options: disband and accept they had been wrong, or reinterpret these horrific events in a way that transformed defeat into victory. The resurrection was the genius theological solution to this dilemma. It did not deny Jesus' shameful death, but instead reframed it as part of a divine plan. The crucifixion was no longer a pathetic end, but a necessary sacrifice, and the empty tomb was the divine vindication of Jesus' claims. Suddenly, the failed Messiah became a victorious Lord who had conquered death itself. This narrative was incredibly powerful. It provided comfort to the grieving followers, gave them a renewed sense of purpose, and transformed their fear into a fervent missionary zeal. With a living Jesus, they were no longer just following the teachings of a dead rabbi. They were serving a living Lord who would soon return. The power of this narrative also explains why Christianity was able to survive and thrive. It offered the hope of life after death to a world filled with uncertainty and suffering. The claim that the disciples were willing to die as martyrs for their belief is often presented as proof of the resurrection's truth. However, history shows that people are willing to die for all sorts of beliefs that turn out to be false. The early Christian martyrs were not dying for a verifiable historical fact. They were dying for a profound, transformative conviction that gave meaning to their lives and promised glory in the next. The resurrection, in the end, was not a historical event, but a powerful founding myth, a story born of desperation and woven from hope that succeeded in changing history, not because it actually happened, but because people desperately needed it to be true. So there you have it. 7 historical clues that challenge the narrative we've all been taught. The final decision is in your hands. Are these just coincidences, or are they puzzle pieces pointing to a much larger truth? We want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts and your arguments in the comments section below. Let's open up an intelligent and critical discussion. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive investigation. We'll see you in the next video.